But when we put a trigger warning a priori on something like that, what we're basically saying to the survivor is your story is taboo.
Yeah.
And we're going to tell everybody before you even tell it that they're not allowed to discuss it anywhere else. This is top secret stuff.
We talked about warning labels last time, and what do warning labels go on? They go on things that are harmful. They go on things that are dangerous, because there's an inherent harm in exposing these things to the public. You need to be careful of how you take in these stories. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast series that takes the BS out of behavioral science. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires.
So first thing, some exciting news. This is episode 38, but we were nominated for a finalist, or we made it as a finalist in the MM&M Use of Podcasting category. These are the annual awards for medical marketing and media, which is our industry trade rag, as they used to call it, our trade magazine, our insider's guide. So we're pretty excited about that. It's nice to get a little bit of recognition. How do you feel about that, Gabe?
Hey, look, I'm pretty excited. It's amazing to see like this podcast and watch it grow from day one to see it become what it has. And Brad, it's interesting. I know you always say like we're not Joe Rogan.
Right.
But
literally dozens of people hear this.
Hey, look, but Joe Rogan, I don't think he's ever won an MM&M, you know?
He has definitely not won an MM&M. So take that. He's never even been a finalist. So we're already ahead of Joe Rogan.
So there we go.
So there we go. I'm very happy for us. I am. And a big shout out to Sanika. She's big part of the team. She's, of course, off on maternity leave, but couldn't have done it without her. The episodes that we submitted are the ones on... I can't remember which ones we submitted.
We submitted the rare disease episode, our episode with Afshan. Shouts out to her too, because she was the one who, when we first met her, she was like, "Are you applying to these awards?
Yeah,
Are you doing these awards?" So
thank you for Afshan to push us. And then
the Generations episode as well,
which was you, me, and Sanika, right? Being Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Y. And we just smoked Sanika on that one. She had no idea what we were talking about, because we're a connected generation, right? I'm the parental generation and you're the same age as my oldest kid. So we had a lot of references in common that she was like, what? All right. So today's going to be a follow-up on our conversation about warning labels and social media.
Yeah, we're going to look into trigger warning. We had somebody reach out from our previous episode, Anna Calix. Brad would be able to tell her story a bit better. We actually want to have her on the podcast eventually, but the conversation of trigger warnings came up and the effectiveness of those, as we were talking about the effectiveness of warning label last time. So we want to spend this episode kind of getting into the idea of trigger warnings before we have Anna on to talk more about her perspective on it and her point of view. So Brad, I think starting very broadly out, could we talk about trigger warnings, what they are, where they came from?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. If you've been to school or around school, or if you've watched TV, or if you've listened to something in the past 10 years, you've probably had a trigger warning. Now, trigger warnings are a very specific kind of content advisory, a very specific kind of signal for what's coming next. They are designed specifically to prevent trauma and prevent a, quote, re-triggering or a triggering of a certain kind of physical, neurological, pathophysiological, pathoneurophysiological response to a stimulus for someone who's had post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Someone who's had trauma who has then developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And so the idea is that certain topics, certain words, certain phrases, certain pictures can trigger an involuntary response for a post-traumatic stress disorder survivor. And so trigger warnings are a goodwill gesture. That's probably not the right way of thinking of it, but they are well-intended, designed to prevent harm. And one of the things that came up in discussions with Anna, who had listened to the Shame, Stigma, Taboo episode, she brought up that putting a trigger warning on her story, and I don't want to too mysterious. It's about miscarriage. She was interviewed about her miscarriage experience, and the person doing the interviewing wanted to put a trigger warning on it. And she felt that that was inappropriate, but she also felt that that was stigmatizing her and silencing her story a little bit. We'll drop that specific element for now because we are going to have her back on and talk about that particular issue. But the idea that they're not as benign the trigger warnings are not as benign, perhaps, as we tend to think of them, that like over applying them or using them on everything actually isn't doing the work that we want it to do, is what we started really diving into, right? So let's just be really clear on the definition. A trigger warning is a content warning that is put in front of a piece of content that someone has decided is potentially re-traumatizing for someone who has experienced trauma. And it gives them the opportunity to pull out of the discussion or to simply skip to the next part of the podcast. I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. The interesting part is this word of trigger. Trigger comes from the Dutch to pull, right? So it's a mechanical idea. It's a lot of times when like something like a trigger on a gun is invented, you go like, well, where did it start from? It goes, oh, it starts from a bow. No, this was literally a device that you pull and something happens. And so it has metaphorically become something that sets something off, right? You pull the trigger on a gun, a series of mechanical things happen, which lead to a chemical thing that leads to a bullet being fired. In this case, so it's reliable, right? You pull the trigger, the gun is supposed to go off. In this case, it's a neurobiological reaction that you can't help, right? You can trigger a physical response or a neurobiological response. So a car backfiring may trigger in a combat veteran a PTSD response that has him or her diving under the table. We know this can happen. We know that trauma can rewire your brain. I'll leave it at that sort of level. The challenge, what are we putting trigger labels on for people who haven't been traumatized? Because this is a theory of post-traumatic stress being triggered. But if we're just talking about upsetting content, say sexual violence, birth trauma, reproductive trauma in general, racial trauma, any sort of taboo subject, right? That's a different sense of the word trigger. That means I'm upset, right? And when you start looking at the word trigger being used in society today, you'll see that people go like, oh, I find that comic triggering, meaning I viscerally hate that person. And we saw yesterday, right? We were looking at bad lab photography, like, which is everywhere. It's actually kind of funny, where actual lab technicians look at the stock photography that's being used in advertising around laboratories or laboratory science, and it's just pictures of people looking at colored liquid in Erlenmeyer flasks and like pipetting without pipette tips. Like everything is wrong in these pictures to people who actually work in labs, and they find that triggering, but it's a different sense of trigger, right? They're upset, they're offended, they're not happy, they viscerally react, but they're not being re-traumatized by this sort of idiotic portrayal of lab work. Yes, it's blue liquid, right? Like there are 3 scientists standing around in safety goggles looking at blue liquid in an Erlenmeyer flask just makes them angry, but it's not actually trauma. And so the question becomes, are trigger warnings overused? Function do they play when people put trigger warnings on things? We always can sort of hide behind the idea that we're being sensitive. But if the person telling the story is the one whose story is being trigger warninged, that doesn't feel as benign, right? That was what came out of this conversation. So we did a deep dive on that.
And one thing that was sticking out to me from what you were saying, Brad, was that distinction between triggers and trauma and the emotional response. And while that distinction is important to make, it's difficult to parse out what exactly is one or the other for an individual.
Yeah, and so I am not an experimental psychologist, but I can read experimental psychology. It turns out there's a lot of literature on this, that people are we're not the first people who've noticed that trigger warnings are being used everywhere. And they're being used on things like Huckleberry Finn. They're being used on things, literature like To Kill a Mockingbird is designed to make you uncomfortable. It's supposed to make you challenge your own perceptions of race and all the rest of it. And are we doing a disservice to literature by trigger warning it? Are we doing a disservice to people's stories by trigger warning them? And are we doing anything at all by putting trigger warnings, right? So again, let's make a real clear thing. No one is saying that putting a content advisory or even just a content label and going like, this is what's in this movie, right? There are sex scenes in this movie, probably not appropriate for children. I appreciate that. I have children. I would like to know what is in movies. I don't want to be explaining things to people. A trigger warning is saying that there are people that you can actually do physical harm to.
Right. It's more of an action for the audience. It's
Correct.
like mind your mental health. And that's one of the things about trigger warnings and their effectiveness as far as like the desired outcome of a trigger warning that I've been thinking about. The mental health aspect is just stay wary of what you're seeing and what you're looking at is probably the biggest value I can see from putting a trigger warning on something for an audience, even if you were to overuse it and put it for an audience that probably isn't going to be re-triggered, but triggered for the first time. And there's a conversation there whether or not the content itself is triggering. But I think that stay mindful of your mental health is ultimately the point of trigger warnings, and that may be difficult to quantify.
Well, there's some debate in the psychological literature. Actually, there doesn't seem to be any debate whatsoever. There seems to be some clarity that trigger warnings aren't really sparing people from trauma.
Right.
So there's two sort of experimental ideas here. One is, what do trigger warnings do for the untraumatized? And the other is, what do trigger warnings do for the traumatized? So for the untraumatized, let's take a classroom full of kids, how many of them have firsthand experience of slavery, for example, versus how many of them have generational trauma from hearing about slavery, versus how many of them are just traumatized by the concept of slavery. I'm not saying these aren't traumatic things. I'm saying the theory of PTSD is that your brain has been rewired through trauma. You've gone through something, and that can be re-triggered to send you right back there. That's not what we're talking about when we put a trigger warning on Roots. We're saying that this is going to be upsetting to you. This is going to be a display of human abuse and debasement, or whatever words we want to put it. Let's all agree, like, it is upsetting to watch Kunta Kinte be whipped into accepting a new name. That is not a cool scene. That is a very powerful scene, but it's a very important scene. What they have found is that trigger warnings for the audience tend not to do very much. They tend to, as many people as turn away, they also bring people in, right? Like, it's a little bit like that explicit lyrics warning on records. Like, there's a certain person who's attracted to a trigger warning. But the other thing is, it just seems to prime people to be offended, but not actually, it doesn't spare them from being upset. It primes them for being upset. I find that interesting. I find, if that's the case, then what's really happening with trigger warnings in a university setting, which I'm very familiar with, is you can get accused of being insensitive very quickly when you're behind the podium. And so it's almost a rhetorical defensive mechanism by going, I recognize that this will upset some of you, right, so I will put a trigger warning on it.
Yeah, there was a lot in some of the reading I was doing about like anticipatory stress versus like the stress you see at the time, and how trigger warnings may like level it out a bit, where you kind of set yourself up for, this may be stressful, this may be triggering, this may be offensive.
Right. And in that sense, it's the semantics of the word trigger that I'm thinking maybe we're really focusing on, because I think a content warning is fine. A content advisory is fine. I think you'd be foolish to the point of suicidal these days to get in front of a classroom and not give people a heads up that, like, we're about to talk about some tough stuff, like, everybody, I want everybody to be prepared, but I also want everybody to know that I recognize that I can't just sort of start using the N-word because we're looking at certain songs or something like that. Right. I teach, in the master's in branding at the School of Visual Arts, and one of the classes I'll teach, or take several classes usually, is talking about taboos. And I'll try and get people comfortable with the idea that we're going to talk about stuff and see stuff and use words that, are upsetting. I have completely stopped using the words themselves. At one point, I would sort of show it's not the phonetic form that the word isn't triggering, but I don't say C-bomb anymore because of the reaction, like literally visceral reaction that people have. So I get that. I get there's a sensitivity, but again, it's this idea of triggering, and it's the idea that a story that someone is telling of what happened to them could be triggering. And that's the part where I think we really stepped into something where I have much more of a moral quandary. I don't have a problem telling people it's a trigger warning, but in looking at what happens when people try and tell their story of sexual violence, of birth trauma, of things that they went through, a torture. I'm I met somebody who had been tortured when I was in my graduate school in the Argentinian dirty wars. And, those are tough stories to hear, should people care to tell them. But when we put a trigger warning a priori on something like that, what we're basically saying to the survivor is your story is taboo.
Yeah.
And we're going to tell everybody before you even tell it that they're not allowed to discuss it anywhere else, that this is top secret stuff. And at least one person we've talked to, Anna, has felt re-stigmatized by this. She's felt cut off from the ability to simply work through this grief in a public way, that every step of the way she's been that they wouldn't let her talk about it in the hospital, at the funeral home, that it was a continuous sort of like, sorry, dear, but your experience is not one that we're willing to air without a warning.
Right.
And she's insisted and refused not to do that. Again, I feel like we're giving away some of that episode.
Yeah, but I mean, if we were to kind of stir away from it a bit, I don't even know if I'm turning into it now, but like we talked about warning labels last time, and what do warning labels go on? They go on things that are harmful. They go on things that are dangerous. They go on things that we should be wary about using, wary about approaching. Right. Yeah. And potentially social media now. Right. It's because there's an inherent harm in exposing these things to the public. You need to be careful of how you take in these stories.
And so we started talking. I know people don't always look at things, right? Gabe is African-American, white. I am beige-ish white, but I'm certainly not like Scandinavian white, but I'm white, right?
Yeah.
Like I am half Jewish, half English, and I tan well, let's say that, right? So, but I am white and Gabe is not. And should, how would we feel about trigger warnings on something like interracial couple kissing in this movie? Like, I would be pretty pissed off about that, like Jewish guy marrying Christian girl, trigger warning. Like that would piss me off, because it would make it seem like my parents' marriage was so taboo, no one was allowed to talk about it, that we all had to be very sensitive and dance around it. Or the idea that two people of different races might fall in love is so triggering. That's not a trigger I mind, right? And so when you look at it that way, it's like, trigger warning, women voting, right? Like it simply reinforces what's taboo at the time. I'm not dismissing this. So I do think there's important things for trigger warnings, right? So let's get to a straight physical trigger warning. Flashing lights can trigger seizures in certain kind of people. That is literally a trigger. It's that idea of like something happens, your body can't help itself, and it then reacts, right? The idea of trigger warnings for the traumatized, let's say somebody's been through war, let's do PTSD, right? Well, but you could insert sexual violence, incest, child abuse. There's any number of things that get trigger warnings that people can be traumatized by. The question is then, do they even work for them? And the answer is probably not. So are content warnings advised? Yes. Do people who've gone through war want to see war movies? That's up to them, right? We should give them like intense combat scenes, a warning that this is coming. But as far as we can tell, what triggers a post-traumatic stress disorder response is not necessarily a recounting of similar events. It's things like smells and sounds, and somebody looks like something that you experienced, or somebody says something that you heard in the middle of trauma, or somebody reminds you of something. So, famous example, there was a combat veteran in the East Bay of California, up in Northern California. He had not received the services he probably needed to reintegrate after having been trained to kill, and then doing so in a very intense way. And he was in a cab, and I think the cab driver was speaking Farsi. Whatever he was speaking, it was an Afghan language. And the guy pulled him out of the cab and basically put a gun in his mouth, and is now serving heavy time, correctly, for assault with a gun. But the question was, at his defense, was he triggered by hearing the language that he had associated with the enemy into a combat state? And that was the defense. And actually, I saw this story on a report on how poorly we've serviced the servicemen, as it were, helped them reintegrate. This guy was just thrown back into civil society without any sort of protection. And he was, quote, triggered by something he heard. We wouldn't put a trigger warning on Farsi. We wouldn't put a trigger warning on foreign languages, like warning, Japanese spoken now for combat vets from World War II. You just have to do the work yourself, right? It's circling back to what we're talking about, it's not clear that literature triggers anything in a post-traumatic stress patient. Now, I am just quoting what I'm reading from peer-reviewed articles. So these are experimental. If somebody listening has a very different experience, I would love to hear about it. These are experimental, and they're also qualitative, some of them. Some of them are quant, some of them are qual. Anecdotally and quantitatively, it seems that trigger warnings aren't doing the work we thought they did. They don't prevent people from getting triggered, because what's getting trigger warnings aren't triggers.
Yeah.
Raw combat footage might be a trigger, but it's probably more the noise or something like that, right? So anyway,
one thing my mind is going to now, as far as like we know what triggers are, we have an understanding of what they are, and I feel like from this conversation we've gone over that. I think more of what they signal, how they appear, how people talk about them, and how they're used. You were talking before about the lab example about
I am triggered.
This triggers me, and so it clearly doesn't mean the same thing in every single context. So I think one part that would be interesting to go into now is like, what does the word trigger itself signal nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, the core semantics of trigger is, again, to pull. Right. Comes out of the early firearms stuff, because you don't fire a bow, you loose an arrow. There's no fire involved. So whenever you watch a movie and somebody goes fire and people let go of the arrows, like, yeah, that's an anachronism. Nobody said fire, right? You put fire to gunpowder. So a trigger in my mind is that kind of like chain of events, an inevitable chain of events. A certain type of explosion, like a detonator triggering off a larger explosion.
Right.
And in that sense, it's a metaphor for a dysregulated response, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder is defined in some ways by neural pathways that are like blasted wide open. And so you can be thrown directly back into a stressful situation, parasympathetic, your heart rate goes up, you start sweating, you get disoriented, you feel nauseous, whatever it is, right? Or you go into combat mode, fight or flight, you get a huge adrenaline dump, you end up dragging a cabbie out of a cab, something like that. Those are triggered responses. I think it's that idea of semantic bleaching that we talked about a long time ago. A very technical term has now been broadly disseminated to go like, I find the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the third party triggering. I find that actor triggering. I find the situation, that color. Famously, when we talked about this episode, someone said, I find trigger warnings triggering, which was very meta and funny. But what she was saying is, I've seen too many of them. So I think they're doing a disservice in two ways. One is, I think we're not being very thoughtful about what we're putting trigger warnings on. Again, nobody is saying we should blind the content and everything will be a surprise and you've just showed your child, whatever. We intend to shock, I was talking to Gabe about driver's ed classes we took, and they still do. They used to be called red asphalt films, right? They're deliberately shocking. They don't come with a trigger warning because they want to shock us. They want to make us put on our seatbelts and drive the speed limit and look both ways because they don't want us murdering people with the cars or ourselves. That's the most triggering thing I ever saw with some of these like photos from car crashes. And they deliberately didn't put a trigger warning on them. I would have appreciated a content warning at 7:30 in the morning at 16 years old. But I think we are using them as a form of censorship right now. We're using them as a form of like, well, if you don't want to hear the truth about history, we'll let you out because it will be too upsetting to you. I think the more devastating consequence is when you trigger warning people's stories themselves, because you're basically telling them, I'll let you tell your story, but only under the condition that you admit that this story is not for everyone's ears. And that's kind of putting the burden on the speaker. It's kind of putting the burden on the victim of trauma in a way that I don't agree with. So in that sense, I think trigger warning somebody's conversation, again, content, explicit label, whatever you want.
It's tough because how do you say trigger warning, but please proceed? Please learn what you're supposed to get from this person's story.
And again, maybe it's just, changing trigger to content would not change a thing. but I think we are using them too much, right? We're debasing the concept. We're certainly not helping trauma victims by making everything a trigger warning. So it was an interesting dive into what can content do to you, and what do we owe the audience, and what do we owe the author. I think let's be more thoughtful about what we trigger warning, in part because it has an impact on the author as much as it does on the audience, perhaps more so because it's their story. So I'm not, again, an experimental psychologist or psychiatrist or any of those things. So I can only cite from the research, but the literature seems to say doesn't work, not working as intended. Nothing in the literature that we've found so far talks about impact on the author. I think we're the first ones to sort of really start looking at that. And I would say that that's an interesting angle as well. So in other words, the warnings, do they work? Not as intended. They certainly are well-intentioned in many cases. Nobody is advocating for the re-traumatization of the traumatized, but I also don't think we're sparing them the re-traumatization in the way that we're using trigger warnings. What we are doing is giving a whole bunch of people permission to not read tough stuff.
Yeah. I want to squeeze in one more question here, Brad, as far as like, I mean, we work in advertising, we write briefs and things like that. And so sometimes the brief will be like, we need to shake someone up. We need to destigmatize. We need to wake them up. And so I think about trigger warnings, X advertising. How would that work? Is the intention to shock like harmful all the time? Is it something that we should do away with? How do you feel about the need to wake somebody up or shake them up? How does advertising destigmatize in a world where we would feel the need to place a trigger warning on it?
So I think it would have to come down to, could we do harm? There's an example of genuine harm from content. An old example I'm going to use, I won't name the company, but about 15 years ago, a company put out a virtual psychotic break. It was available, you could find it online, and it was, what's it like to have a psychotic break? And I was interested in this because I was working on antipsychotics at the time. And the TV started talking to you. Like, it was like a first person view of the room, and like the TV starts talking to you and telling you like really, really grim stuff, like nobody likes you and what are you doing and why are you even here? And it's just like all of a sudden you're thrust into a sort of virtual madness. That should have had a trigger warning because it could actually trigger a psychotic break among people who were schizophrenic, it turns out. That was a dangerous video to put up there. It was informative to me, but it actually could trigger somebody into a psychotic break. That's the real meaning of trigger, by the way, or the core meaning of trigger. And so I think those sorts of things should come with trigger warnings, or just shouldn't be put out on the internet, frankly, unless you put it behind a paywall for doctors or something. But if we start talking about, like, is it shocking the idea that young women would use birth control, then don't watch it. So you see what I'm saying? Like, it depends on the content. It depends on what we're talking about. We haven't really dealt with anything, you and I, that I would consider taboo. Not universally so. It might be socially or religiously taboo to have premarital sex, or to talk about, non-procreative sex, or to talk about, your irritable bowel disease or something like that. But our job is to talk about these things in a way that's not upsetting, but informative. If we need to shock people into action, I think I would more look at the Why Not Fear episode and go, we can shock people, but I don't think it's going to make them happy, right?
Right.
You really need to show people a positive way. So forward. So again, I would say anything that needs a trigger warning in advertising, a true trigger warning, we probably shouldn't release. Anything that needs a content advisory, we need to rethink the audience and whether or not, it's appropriate. And if it's appropriate and someone finds it shocking because they're 85 and they don't believe young people should be having sex till they've been married, well, we don't live in that society anymore. Watch a different channel.
Yeah, and I just think that's so important because we're in health and we kind of play in this world between taboos and what's harmful and how people take things. It's so sensitive a lot of the time. So I think it's important just to make sure we have that distinction. We're not intending to hurt, and if we are intending to hurt, we probably shouldn't go forward with it.
Right. Look, every shocking healthcare ad I can think of was hurtful. Right. So the one that I use in my class sometimes is a young woman who had pancreatic cancer, young, like teenage looks like. It's got lumps all over her head, and it says, "I wish I had breast cancer." Now, what she meant was, "I wish I had a treatable cancer." And by the way, she didn't say it. That's, but what the copywriter meant was, "I wish I had a treatable cancer because the one I have isn't treatable." But nobody wishes they had breast cancer, and that ad backfired badly on the group. I mean, it obviously offended everyone who's ever been associated with either having or knowing someone who had breast cancer. No one would say, "I wish I had X," right? So it was, it was clumsy, it was awkward, it was upsetting. It triggered anger, but was it triggering? I don't think so, but I don't think we do a great job when we offend people anyway. So if we talk about things that are upsetting because people think they shouldn't be talked about, that's a different sort of thing. But if it's truly triggering, like a virtual psychotic break, we probably shouldn't release it.
Right. I feel like we've thoroughly covered trigger warnings up to the extent that it'd be great to bring in Anna right now.
Well, I think so. Just to Anna Calix has a website called Gifts from Liam. We'll put the link in the chat. We really appreciated Anna reaching out and talking to us. It got us thinking about all sorts of stuff, and we encourage the audience, reach out to us, right? Like, we clearly take this seriously. If we've said something in this episode that you disagree with, or you have experimental data that proves trauma can be triggered by reading literature, let us know. We'd love to hear it.
Our mailboxes are open, medicalanthropology@havas.com.
Yeah.
Feel free to send us a note.
We'd love to hear from you. All right. So with that, enjoy the heat. It is not pleasant outside, so we're happy to be in an air-conditioned studio recording this. And for Breaking the Code, I'm Brad Davidson.
And I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Breaking the Code is a podcast created and produced by Havas Health and Use Medical Anthropology Department. Hosted by Brad Davidson and Sneaka Garcia. Content and post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.